Hello and welcome to our first review for the new Storm Summit Peak. This one will feature Angel and I, while the next two will feature Zach Rhodes, whom you met on the Sublime review, plus an additional new tester who will be joining us as well. The Peak releases on January 19th with the absolute power. There are links in the description to Bowler's Mart for both balls, in addition to the comparison balls you'll see later in the video. We're bowling on the Kegel Chromium lane condition that we always use for testing. It's a challenge pattern at just under a 7-to-1 ratio. It's 42 feet long, 25.5 mils. It's the heavy side of medium for both volume and length. It's not as easy as a house shot, but not as punishing as a sport pattern. Big shout out and thanks as always to Royal Crest Lanes for getting it set up for us. All it takes is a text and we have everything we need. Angel's layout is her standard 4 5/8 by 3.5 by 2.5. This is the same layout she uses on everything, plus we also took her ball down to 1000 grit with Jayhawk Bowling Supply's Diamond Dust pads on a resurfacing machine before finishing with Storm's Reactive Scuff to get it up to a 3000-ish grit sheen. Angel's our control tester because her game represents the medium speed, medium rev, average league bowler, and every ball she drills gets the same layout and starts with the same surface prep to establish a basis for comparison. My opening monologues about the ball tech are usually long enough that they'd piss off Sergeant Lincoln Osiris.
What you getting at with the book script? Spit that shit out, man!
So I'll cut right to the chase. The Summit Peak is a straight up Pearl Summit. The TX23 cover formula is an updated, stronger version of the TX16 cover stock that's on the Phase 2 and now on the Journey, which we'll see as a comparison ball later in the video. The strong symmetric centripetal HD core from the Sonic and Supersonic now finds itself inside the new AI or amplified inertia outer core again for the Peak after that combination debuted on the original Summit. AI enhances or amplifies the core's natural or existing strength, driving the RG down to 246 and the differential up to 056 and 15 pounds, making it an absolute monster. Angel's Peak was kind of inconsistent and mostly lazy to start out, but so was her original Summit. The core creates a super heavy roll that makes it look like the ball's trying to dig through the lane. It wants to slow down quickly, and while it is longer and sharper than the original Summit, that doesn't mean it's actually long and sharp. It's in amped up Zen territory, though it is more continuous than the Zen. As the video continues to roll, you should see the point of why we put several games on a ball for a review, as it wakes up eventually and gets pretty punchy. Everything requires a break-in period. Shoes, baseball gloves, softball bats, basketballs. My new smoker even had its own little manual for the initial firing process, so I'll never understand why people expect a new bowling ball to be absolutely perfect and fit their game and conditions exactly out of the box without them having to break it in or make any surface adjustments, God forbid move their feet or something before declaring the ball sucks, and then put it up for sale with less than 2 games on it, all while complaining about the price of equipment, of course. I'll get further into this when we flip over to my side, but the other claim with the new AI core is that it carries the off hits better. I was skeptical because that's one of those things that sounds like straight up marketing. However, I came around on the Summit and believe it's actually a thing. However, again, the question still remained, was that going to be a universal thing, or did it just happen to be a lightning in a bottle type deal with the original Summit? I can't quite tell with Angel, but back to the ball reaction. Her reaction after a couple games of breaking the ball in matched my experience with it. Again, it's very strong and early rolling. I'd also use the word relentless. It looks like a tank rolling through the pins, and I'm not meaning to say it hits like a truck. I'm trying to describe a specific element of the ball reaction, which is that it's controllable and fairly smooth and gradual, but the heaviness of the roll translates to a very strong and relentless roll through the pins. It picks up and then firmly chugs through the deck. Some balls have strong back-end moves where they pick up and drive, but some of those can cut or slice through the pins too sharply, which results in some weird and undesirable leaves, but the Peak is like a big diesel truck that keeps the pins low, which is important for pin carry. We're going to compare it to the Journey with her for a few reasons. One, the Journey has the same kind of tumbly shape that doesn't really rev up. They both have that same gradual, consistent, kind of metered tempo in their roll. 2, the Journey is also a strong symmetric ball, but the F8 core is a definite step down from the Centripetal HD with AI and strength. Finally, the Journey's cover is TX16 Pearl, which the Peak's TX23 Pearl is an evolution of. The first thing I notice or pick up on is that while the overall shot shape looks similar, the Journey glides down the lane. It doesn't try to slow down at all like the Peak does. The F8 core in 15 pounds has a 252 RG, which is quite a bit higher than the 246 in the Peak, while the 053 differential is marginally lower and virtually negligible. This is a great illustration of how much difference 6 points of RG can make, because while I don't think the peak cover is a ton stronger than the journey cover, the higher RG helps the journey get down the lane much easier before then being a little sharper than the peak down lane. However, on some of these shots you can see that if the journey doesn't get the traction, it kind of wiggles or misses the spot or struggles to finish. Now there were a couple shots when Angel's peak didn't hook, but it looked like it was just too slow making the turn, not that it was necessarily struggling to make it. I think the journey is a beyond perfect step down from the peak. The overall shot shape is extremely similar, it's just obviously a cleaner and weaker ball. The tricky part is that if you have enough friction, the journey is going to cover more boards, specifically because it's weaker and more responsive. More responsive balls that have plenty of friction are going to fly, but stronger balls like the peak are designed to be smoother, more even, and more controllable across the board, so they tend to ignore the conditions a little more. The peak is still going to be a tank on drier conditions, while the journey is really going to come to life, but on a condition like this that's a little longer and heavier, the journey isn't quite enough for the fresh. It can fake it on a couple shots, but the peak is more in control. Now when the shot starts to dry up and you need to get deeper with something that gets down the lane easier, the journey perfectly bridges that gap because it will get you through the fronts much more cleanly but still have that controlled tumble down lane. It's not going to hit friction and break loose. Flipping sides, my layout is 5x2. Typically I go with stronger pins on symmetric balls to make them more aggressive earlier because mid lane control is insanely important on the left side. This core is crazy strong though, and because I went 4.5 on the pin for my original TNT, which also has a really tanky core, that ended up being too strong, so I went up to 5 on the pin distance for the original Summit. That's been amazing and will be my comparison ball in a minute, so I definitely wanted to do the same thing on the peak. Once again, I like to start shiny with everything because that tells me how strong the ball actually is. Everything hooks with surface on it, and while weaker balls get significantly weaker with shine, stronger balls will retain most of their strength. I took mine down to 1000 grit with Jayhawk Bowling Supply's Diamond Dust pads first, and then finished with a light application of Storm Step 2 compound. Step 2 is discontinued and no longer available, but I have gotten my hands on the rough and smooth edge compounds and will be testing those out soon. The Summit rolls so strong and heavy that I actually have to throw it differently than I do most other balls, and the Peak is the same experience. Neither of them like to be banged on, so to speak. They much prefer a softer hand and to kind of be floated so that it moves the reaction further down the lane. If you try to roll either of them or really rev them up, they use up too much energy too early and either dig in and go or just kind of give up down lane. The easier I am with my release, the more dynamic the ball reaction is because, again, instead of using everything up at 30 feet, it's using it on the back end for its move into the pins. This is a very strong ball that doesn't need any help doing anything. You kind of have to get out of its way and let it do the work. You have to forget the generally accepted definition of a pearl ball with this one. Much like the Zen, it doesn't really apply, or it doesn't give you the reaction that comes to mind when you think pearl. It's not the super clean and flippy reaction. To reiterate what I said above with Angel, it's cleaner and sharper than the original Summit, but that's not really saying much because the Summit is one of the earliest rolling and digging symmetric balls out there. It's like an amped up Zen, though it is more continuous. As I've been doing lately, I also took the Peak down to 2000 to check it out, though it did act just fine with the shine, with one little twist. I think the extra friction response shiny made it slightly more forward than the Summit. You saw on some of those shots that it straightened out a little on the back end, so ideally the surface will blend the wet and dry a little more and make the ball walk off friction rather than kind of jerking and stopping. As expected, it's just not getting down the lane from the first zone, so I moved in quickly, and here's my spiel on surface. Surface isn't always meant to create more traction or dig. Sometimes it can be used to simply blend the reaction out. I refer to 2000 and under as traction grits and 2000 and above as shape grits because 2000 is kind of the tipping point. Under that is where you really see the traction increasing significantly. The ball gets a lot earlier and smoother. Over that, you're really just making the ball a little smoother without affecting the length or strength much. This is why I choose to use 2000 in the videos, because if I went with 500, everything would just dig in super early regardless. But over 2000, and you're not going to see much of a difference, so 2000 I think is a reasonable adjustment that leaves the ball in usable condition and still gives us some information. This also tells me that this is definitely a strong cover because we aren't seeing much difference shiny versus dull at all. With surface, it's a little earlier and blends the friction a little better, but otherwise it's virtually the same reaction. There's a little wrinkle in here though. It was already plenty early with the shine, but I bailed out of a couple of these shots because it was taking a significant amount of effort to be soft enough to get the ball down the lane, but still put a decent roll on it. There's a sharp tipping point between being soft and dumping it, as well as throwing it hard without just launching it or chucking it, and speed with roll is still pretty challenging for me. As far as the improved carry on the off hits thing goes, I think the Peak hits and carries well, but it's not quite as magical as the Summit is. I think the extra friction response burns a touch more energy responding to friction than the Summit does, and that kind of returns it to the mortal realm, so to speak. But I'm obviously still very happy, and this is going to hang out in the bag next to the Summit indefinitely, though I'm obviously going to let it shine back up. Speaking of the Summit, I only filmed for the Summit Shiny, so keep that in mind. Same surface process as I did for the Peak, and the layout is also the same. I'll try to find something productive or interesting to say while we watch, but this one is really simple. The Summit is a little rounder, a little slower to respond to friction, and a little more continuous than the Peak. Very similar strengths, very similar overall reactions, to the point that I'm not entirely sure that they're great complements. I'll have a better feel for this in a couple months for the report card, but other than the slight shape difference, they're really similar and it feels like there's going to be a significant amount of overlap. Now personally, I'll still carry them together because shape deltas or differences in a similar strength zone is what's most important to me. I see very little to no transition as far as traction is concerned, so the track doesn't really dry up on lefties and force us deep. It's more that the back end shape settles down and forces us into different shapes to get the ball through the pins the right way. Sometimes the Summit is too early and or too smooth for me, and I haven't really had a good answer for that. My options typically end up being too weak, too sharp, or both. The Peak looks like a subtle answer to a subtle difference, and while you might roll your eyes, I need both hands to count the number of times I've had 530 plus after 2, only for the back ends to tighten up and tap me to death for a clean 190 or 2-0 the last game. The same might be true for you though. The Zen Soul, for example, was very similar to the Zen, but quite a few people used both because even though the difference was subtle, it was the right tweak or the right adjustment. Sometimes you want to make a ball change that keeps you in the same shape or look too, because obviously if the Summit is effective, moving into even a TNT infused is going to change both the traction amount and the shape. So while it might put you in the right zone as far as amount of hook goes, it might put you in the wrong zone where the shot shape is concerned. The Peak for me is going to retain the amount of hook or traction while adjusting the shape, and I have to think that it's finally going to be the ball I've been waiting for. Oh my gosh, I finally got to use it. My journey towards the clickbait side is now complete. To wrap it up, the Peak is exactly what you'd think a Pearl Summit would be, but not what you'd think a Pearl anything else would be. This is definitely the earliest and smoothest quote-unquote Pearl we've ever thrown, so think symmetric exotic gem, turbocharged Zen, etc. Congratulations on completing the Summit Peak training course. Consider this your digital certificate of completion. You're now a certified operator and are cleared to receive on-the-job training, and the cool part about this is that unlike most heavy machinery, the whole point here is knocking things over and creating a mess, so have fun with that. Once again, the Summit Peak and Absolute Power release on January 19th. Have plenty more videos coming for both. The Power review is also up and available, and links to Bowler's Mart are in the description. Remember, of course, that my code ROSEDAL10 will get you 10% off your order at checkout at CoolWick so you can dress sharp and stay cool on the lanes. Thanks for watching, and may the strikes be with you.